You think that's a rifle? Gunnery Sergeant Cole Harris barked, the sound cutting through the dry heat of Camp Pendleton as his Marines snickered behind him. Walt Grayson, 82, stood at the firing line holding a rifle painted bright orange, edges chipped, barrel scratched from decades of use. His hands, veined and steady, barely gripped the stock as he scanned the distant target 4,000 meters away across the valley. The younger Marines leaned against their gear, laptops, and spotting scopes at the ready, mocking the bright color and the worn leather strap. Traffic cone rifle, pops. One of them jeered, and the laughter rippled down the line, sharp and disrespectful. Walt didn't flinch. His pale blue eyes swept over the flags marking the wind, the shimmer of the heat haze rising from the valley floor, the subtle movements of distant dust. He adjusted his stance slightly, inhaling through his nose, feeling the air shift with every subtle thermal current. "You're reading the wrong wind," he said quietly, his voice gravelly yet calm, carrying just enough weight to make those paying attention pause. The Marines snorted, whispering among themselves, convinced the old man could not possibly understand what they had spent hours calculating with their technology. Harris stepped closer, leaning over the scope, fingers brushing the chipped orange paint, mocking the rifle as nothing more than a relic. Walt's gaze dropped to a small indentation near the stock where a scorch mark told a story only he knew. Suddenly, in that second, the dusty range faded, replaced by a flash of memory. Walt kneeling behind the same rifle in a faraway desert, guiding a convoy to safety when all electronics had failed, sunlight glaring off metal, sand in his teeth, the faint hiss of a radio that refused to speak. A young Marine captain had pressed a signal to him, the mission hanging in balance, and Walt had made the impossible shot that changed the outcome of the day. The memory dissipated, leaving him back on the firing line, standing calm, rifle in hand, ignoring the laughter. He crouched slightly, adjusted the bipod, feeling the pulse of the rifle through his hands. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks, standing nearby, squinted at a faded engraving on the rifle. CG-17, a name whispered only among those who knew legends. He frowned, a spark of realization in his gaze, and discreetly reached for his radio. Walt inhaled, eyes fixed on the distant target, not a word escaping his lips, every muscle poised, the silence of experience surrounding him. The Marines waited, unsettled by the serenity of the man they had mocked, a quiet power that didn't need to be shown, only felt. And in that moment, without a signal, without a command, the wind shifted, and all calculations in the room seemed irrelevant compared to the precision rooted in decades of understanding. Every glance from Walt a measure of the impossible about to unfold. The silence stretched across the firing line like a taut cable. Nobody laughed now. The desert wind swept over the valley, rattling range markers and carrying the dry scent of sun-baked earth. Walt Grayson remained motionless behind the rifle, his attention fixed far beyond what most eyes could even see. Around him, screens glowed with ballistic data, wind charts, and digital calculations. The Marines trusted numbers. Walt trusted observation. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Harris folded his arms and forced a smirk back onto his face, unwilling to surrender control of the moment. 4,000 meters, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. You know that is over 2.5 miles, right? A few Marines chuckled nervously, but the confidence behind the laughter was gone. Walt did not answer immediately. His eyes followed a drifting cloud of dust crossing a distant ridgeline. Closer to 2.5 than most people realize, he finally replied. Harris shook his head. Nobody here has even made consistent hits at that distance. Walt nodded slightly. That is because you are aiming at the target. The answer puzzled everyone. Several Marines exchanged confused glances. One of them looked down at his tablet, wondering if he had misheard. Ethan Brooks remained focused on the faded engraving he had noticed earlier. The letters had been worn by decades of handling, but they were still there. CG-17. Copper Ghost. The name tugged at something buried deep in his memory. He had heard it once during a history presentation given by a retired master gunnery sergeant. Not a person, a legend. Ethan slowly stepped away from the firing line and reached for his radio. Meanwhile, Harris walked a slow circle around Walt. Let me guess, he said. You are going to tell us this rifle can do things computers cannot. Walt looked at the valley. No, Harris raised an eyebrow. No. I am going to tell you that computers only know what they are told. The answer landed harder than Harris expected. For a moment, he had no comeback. Heat shimmered, danced above the rocks below. Far away, a hawk drifted on a thermal current invisible to everyone except the old man watching it. Walt adjusted the rifle a fraction of an inch. Not more than the width of a coin. The movement seemed insignificant, yet somehow deliberate. Ethan finally got through on the radio. A staff sergeant answered from headquarters. The young Marine quietly explained what he had found. At first the response was dismissive. Then Ethan mentioned the orange rifle. Silence followed. Several long seconds passed before the voice returned. This time the tone had changed completely. Repeat that designation. Ethan repeated it. Another pause. Then the line abruptly disconnected. Back at the range, Walt lowered his head behind the scope. The joking atmosphere had vanished entirely. Even Harris could feel it. Something unseen was moving beneath the surface of the moment. Something bigger than a training exercise. Somewhere miles away, inside an air-conditioned command building, a senior officer stared at a personnel archive that had not been opened in years. A name had appeared on his screen. Walter Grayson. Beside it sat an old classified call sign. Within seconds another call was placed, this one directed to a general officer. And at the range, completely unaware of the chain reaction beginning to unfold, the old veteran calmly watched the wind and waited for the valley to tell him the truth. Inside the headquarters building, the atmosphere changed before anyone fully understood why. A duty officer who had expected a routine afternoon suddenly found 3 senior personnel standing over his terminal. The file on the screen was old, partially archived, and filled with sections that required authorization levels well above his own. Yet one detail kept drawing their attention. Not the name, not the age, the call sign, Copper Ghost. The officer swallowed hard as another phone rang. Across the base, Major General Richard Calloway listened in silence while a colonel hurried through the report. At first, the information sounded ridiculous. An elderly civilian, an orange rifle, a training range. But then the colonel mentioned the designation. The general stopped walking. For several seconds he said nothing at all. The aide beside him watched his expression shift from curiosity to disbelief. Finally, the general asked a single question. "Are you absolutely certain?" The colonel answered immediately. "Yes, sir." The general looked out the window toward the distant hills beyond the installation. He had been a young captain the first time he heard that call sign. Back then it belonged to a story whispered among instructors, a story that became larger every time it was retold. Most assumed it was exaggerated. Some believed it never happened at all. Yet the classified reports remained. The records remained. And now the name had appeared again. "Get a vehicle ready," the general said quietly. "I am going to the range." Back on the firing line, nobody knew what was happening beyond the valley. The Marines remained focused on Walt. The old veteran had not moved in nearly 2 minutes. He appeared almost statuesque against the bright California sunlight. Heat waves drifted across the landscape. Tiny gusts tugged at loose strands of dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk banked sharply and disappeared into a rising thermal current. Walt watched everything. Gunnery Sergeant Harris tried to maintain control of the situation, but uncertainty had begun creeping into his voice. "You keep staring at birds and dust," he said. "What exactly are you looking for?" Walt answered without lifting his eye from the scope. "Patterns." Harris shook his head. The computer already calculated the pattern. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Walt's mouth. The computer calculated what the air was doing 10 seconds ago. Several Marines glanced toward their screens. None of them liked hearing that. Deep down, they knew conditions were constantly changing. They simply trusted their equipment to keep up. Walt trusted something older. Experience. Ethan Brooks returned from the radio station with a knot in his stomach. He had expected someone to laugh at his report. Instead, people had reacted as if he had triggered an emergency. He looked toward the orange rifle again. Under the bright sun, the faded paint almost seemed ordinary. Yet the longer he stared at it, the more impossible it felt. Objects like that did not survive decades by accident. Neither did men. Walt adjusted his breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. The valley below seemed alive now. Invisible currents rolled between ridges. Sunlight reflected from distant rock faces. Every detail mattered. Every movement meant something. Around him, Conversations gradually faded until the range became unusually quiet. Even the Marines who had mocked him earlier found themselves watching in silence. They could not explain why. Perhaps it was the confidence. Perhaps it was the patience. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that they were witnessing something far older and far greater than a simple marksmanship exercise. And miles away, a convoy carrying a major general accelerated toward the range. The distant hum of a vehicle announced Major General Richard Calloway's arrival long before he stepped onto the firing line. Walt Grayson did not flinch. He adjusted the orange rifle slightly, fingertips grazing the worn wood and faded paint, feeling the subtle vibrations that spoke to the rifle's history. Gunnery Sergeant Harris straightened, a flicker of unease crossing his face as he noticed the officer's sleek black sedan pull up. The Marines, sensing a shift in authority, snapped to attention, the joking and murmurs disappearing instantly. Walt's pale blue eyes remained steady on the valley floor, tracking the slightest movement in the dust and heat shimmer. Ethan Brooks, still near the line, watched the general approach, the weight of decades of protocol and experience reflected in Calloway's posture. The general's steps were deliberate, measured, yet carried an unmistakable energy of someone who had seen history and expected it to repeat. Walt whispered to no one in particular. Every detail matters. Harris nodded silently, realizing that the old veteran was not speaking to the audience, but to the environment itself. The wind shifted, rustling the flags along the ridge and bending the grass. Walt took a deep breath, steadying his stance. "The angle is right," he murmured. The Marines glanced at one another, unsure if the statement was meant to be literal or metaphorical. From the observation tower, a few instructors adjusted binoculars and checked ballistic calculators, but the numbers on their screens could not account for the subtle cues Walt was reading. The interplay of sun, air, and terrain that only a lifetime of observation could reveal. Major General Calloway paused a few steps from the line, eyes narrowing slightly at the rifle's bright color and the veteran's calm composure. For a moment, the base felt suspended in a quiet anticipation. Ethan's hand hovered over the radio, unsure whether to update command or trust the unfolding scene. Walt exhaled slowly, the scope aligned, the stock pressed lightly against his shoulder. He did not rush. Timing, he knew, was everything. The Marines, once boisterous, held their breath collectively, feeling the energy shift, the tension stretching across the valley like a coiled spring. Harris's voice dropped to a whisper. "You really think that can reach it?" Walt did not respond. He did not need to. Every line of sight, every subtle vibration, every minuscule detail of air currents had been absorbed and calculated by a mind sharpened over decades. The general, now standing directly behind the firing line, felt a ripple of recognition, a memory of briefings and long missions, names and designations recalled from decades prior. Walt's finger hovered over the trigger, not tense, not forced, but entirely deliberate. The valley held its breath with him, the heat waves rising and falling, the flags swaying in an imperceptible rhythm. Even the distant hawk seemed to pause in midair, as if acknowledging the singular focus of the old veteran. Every Marine present knew that something extraordinary was about to happen, yet none could predict exactly how the world would shift in the next moments. The general's hand twitched slightly, a silent signal of respect and recognition, but he said nothing, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged entirely to Walt Grayson and the centuries of experience contained in the bright orange rifle resting firmly in his hands. Walt shifted slightly, feeling the subtle recoil of decades pressing through his hands, the orange rifle almost an extension of his own body. He scanned the valley once more, noting the tiny shifts of air and the glimmer of heat across the distant hills. Each small movement was a message, a conversation between the environment and the veteran who knew how to listen. Gunnery Sergeant Harris remained close, posture rigid, eyes darting from the rifle to the valley and back, a tight line of tension drawn across his shoulders. Behind him, the Marines held a nervous stillness, the usual chatter absent, replaced by an anticipation that grew heavier with each passing second. Walt's lips moved slightly, murmuring numbers and angles to himself, calculating in a language the Marines could not hear. Ethan Brooks adjusted his spotting scope, trying to capture even the smallest detail, But he quickly realized that this was beyond optics, beyond any digital reading. Walt had his own instruments, ones built of experience and memory, a combination of intuition and observation honed over decades in environments far harsher than this base. The wind curled in subtle currents, dust shifting imperceptibly across the valley floor. Walt's finger hovered lightly over the trigger, muscles relaxed but attentive. Harris's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. The general's vehicle had just stopped, yet he remained in the background, silent, waiting to witness what had drawn him so swiftly to the range. Walt adjusted the rifle's bipod, aligning it precisely, feeling the micro-vibrations and the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. The Marines followed his movements with a mixture of awe and confusion, each realizing that the calculations on their screens did not encompass the full picture. Ethan leaned forward, heart quickening, as he caught a flash of the rifle's engraved markings glinting in the sunlight. He knew now that the man before them was no ordinary veteran. A hush fell over the range, unspoken but palpable, and the general, stepping out of the vehicle, sensed the change instantly, recognizing the presence of a figure whose reputation had reached even the highest echelons of command decades ago. Walt exhaled, slowly, deliberately, the scope focused, the angle calculated, the valley observed, every imperceptible shift accounted for. Harris took a shallow breath, the tension in his shoulders visible, and the Marines instinctively straightened, hands tightening on equipment, eyes locked on the veteran who had transformed the range from a simple exercise into a stage where the extraordinary was quietly, invisibly unfolding. The heat of the day seemed to hold its breath, the flags along the ridges frozen, the sunlight striking the distant hills in a perfect alignment, and Walt waited, patient, steady, and entirely in command of a moment that the entire base was about to feel reverberate. Major General Richard Calloway stopped several yards behind the firing line and removed his sunglasses. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the distant flutter of range flags and the low whisper of desert wind sliding across the valley. Calloway's eyes settled on the orange rifle. For a brief moment, the years seemed to fall away from his face. He had seen photographs of that rifle long before he ever wore stars on his collar. Grainy archive images, training reports, stories passed quietly between instructors who rarely agreed on anything except one detail. Walter Grayson never missed when conditions mattered most. Gunnery Sergeant Harris noticed the change immediately. The general was not looking at the target. He was looking at the man behind the rifle. That realization unsettled him more than anything else that had happened all afternoon. Nearby, Ethan Brooks watched a colonel step from the convoy and hurry toward the general. The officer leaned close and whispered something. Calloway gave a small nod without taking his eyes off Walt. The colonel fell silent at once. Whatever had been said only confirmed what the general already knew. Walt remained completely unaware of the attention gathering around him. His focus stayed fixed on the valley. He observed a ribbon of dust drifting along a distant ridgeline. A second later, he shifted his gaze toward a cluster of rocks nearly a mile away, then toward a patch of scrub brush farther downrange. To everyone else, the movements seemed random. To Walt, they formed a map. Invisible currents connected every point. Air moved differently over stone than it did over sand. Heat rose differently from open ground than it did from shaded slopes. The valley was speaking. He was listening. Harris finally cleared his throat. "Sir," he said quietly toward the general. "With respect, should we stop this?" Calloway answered without hesitation. "Absolutely not." The response carried enough authority to silence every remaining doubt. Harris looked back toward Walt. The old veteran had not touched a calculator. He had not requested weather data. He had not asked for assistance. Yet somehow he appeared more prepared than anyone present. Ethan adjusted his spotting scope again and felt a chill despite the heat. Through the magnification, he could see the distant target shimmering behind layers of thermal distortion. It barely looked real. Hitting it seemed impossible. Walt slowly closed his left eye and settled behind the scope. The rifle rested naturally against his shoulder, worn smooth by decades of careful use. His breathing slowed. Inhale, exhale, pause. The rhythm was calm enough to lower the tension of everyone watching. Even the Marines who had laughed earlier now stood motionless. The range no longer felt like a training facility. It felt like a classroom. Walt Grayson was teaching a lesson without saying a word. Calloway folded his hands behind his back. Deep inside, he remembered reading a report many years earlier. One sentence had stayed with him ever since. Not because it sounded impressive, because it sounded impossible. The report described a man who understood the environment so completely that he seemed to predict it. As the general watched the old veteran settle into position, he realized something remarkable. The report had not exaggerated a single word. The valley held a quiet, expectant tension as Walt Grayson exhaled slowly, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Every muscle in his body was steady, and his eyes traced the distant shimmer of the target, reading the subtle dance of heat, dust, and wind currents as though they were lines on a page. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Harris leaned forward slightly, aware that every second stretched longer than he could remember, the usual confidence of the Marines now replaced by a silent curiosity, a mixture of awe and disbelief. Walt whispered under his breath, almost as if speaking to the landscape itself, "Steady. Wait for the moment." Ethan Brooks adjusted the spotting scope, focusing on the faint glimmer of the target, and felt a strange stillness descend across the range, the usual hum of machinery and chatter completely absent. Somewhere in the background, the soft crunch of gravel announced Major General Richard Calloway's careful steps approaching, but even his presence did not disturb the delicate equilibrium of attention. Walt's gaze moved along the ridge line, noting how a wisp of wind lifted dust differently depending on the angle of the sun. He could feel the pulse of the air, the subtle pressure changes that would affect the projectile's flight over thousands of meters. He did not rush. Time was measured not by clocks or instruments, but by the rhythm of the environment itself. Harris watched, a bead of sweat forming on his temple, realizing that this was a demonstration of precision, of mastery honed over decades, far beyond anything the Marines had been trained to calculate. Ethan sensed the magnitude of what was unfolding, understanding that every small motion, every breath taken by the veteran, was a calculation unseen yet perfectly accurate. Walt shifted the rifle ever so slightly, aligning it precisely, letting the stock rest against his shoulder as if it were an extension of his own experience. The flags along the distant ridges fluttered unpredictably, a subtle challenge that Walt accounted for without a glance at any digital readout. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Harris finally spoke, his voice low, almost reverent. "Sir, are you certain?" Walt did not answer. He did not need to. Every movement, every pause, every minute adjustment spoke volumes to those watching. The general stopped just behind the firing line, observing the veteran with a quiet recognition, remembering reports and stories from long ago, connecting the present with decades of history. The sun glinted off the distant rocks, and Walt's eye tracked the perfect line of sight, a path invisible to all but the most practiced observer. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as he realized the precision of timing, of observation, of experience, was about to culminate. The range was silent, not a single movement breaking the tension, all eyes on the old man who had turned an ordinary exercise into a lesson in mastery, patience, and the quiet authority that only a lifetime of expertise could command. And Walt waited, entirely composed, every detail accounted for, preparing for a moment that would transform the perception of everyone present. Walt Grayson exhaled slowly, the slight vibration of the orange rifle resonating through his hands, his gaze unwavering as he traced the faint shimmer of the distant target. The valley seemed to pause with him, heat waves curling in slow spirals, dust drifting lazily across the terrain, as if the world itself had become a silent observer. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Harris shifted uneasily, feeling the tension coil tighter across his shoulders, aware that every movement and breath of the veteran carried authority beyond immediate comprehension. The Marines around him straightened instinctively, eyes wide, noticing the stillness, the anticipation thickening the air. Walt's finger hovered lightly over the trigger, attuned to the rhythm of the environment, reading subtle changes in sunlight reflection, the sway of distant foliage, the imperceptible currents of wind that had been invisible to digital instruments. Ethan Brooks felt a strange mixture of fear and admiration, watching the veteran manipulate his surroundings with nothing but experience and observation, realizing that no simulation, no computer, No map could rival the precision encoded in decades of service. Behind them, Major General Richard Calloway stepped forward, the gravel crunching softly under his polished boots, yet he did not speak, did not gesture, content to witness the mastery unfold. The veteran's eyes, pale blue and steady, scanned every inch of the range, connecting details invisible to everyone else. The tilt of a flag, the shimmer over a rock, the pattern of heat ripples. Harris's voice was barely audible. "Sir, is it ready?" Walt's subtle nod was enough. The old man lowered himself slightly, aligning the rifle, every adjustment deliberate, unhurried, yet perfectly precise. The Marines watched, silent, their previous confidence dissolved, replaced by the understanding that they were witnessing a lesson in timing, patience, and mastery. Ethan's gaze drifted to the rifle's markings once again, the faded engraving catching the sunlight. CG-17, Copper Ghost. Recognition dawned, an invisible thread linking past and present, history and this moment. Calloway's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest crease of remembrance passing across his forehead, acknowledging the weight of the legacy in front of him. The valley held its breath, birds paused mid-flight, the wind itself seemed suspended. Walt exhaled once more, steady, controlled, the world around him fading until only the target, the rifle, and the subtle messages of the environment remained. Harris adjusted slightly, sensing that the culmination of years of skill, observation, and patience was imminent. Every observer felt it, the shift from routine to extraordinary, the moment when human mastery commanded silence and attention, and when decades of experience made the impossible tangible, imminent, and unavoidable. The tension stretched, held, and all at once the range and the valley seemed to focus entirely on the veteran, waiting for the invisible line of calculation, intuition, and observation to meet its destination. Walt exhaled slowly, the scope aligned perfectly, the orange rifle resting lightly yet firmly against his shoulder, and then, with the quietest of motions, he squeezed the trigger. The sound barely carried, yet it seemed to resonate through the valley, a subtle vibration that drew every eye and ear toward the distant hills. The heat shimmer rippled across the target, the tiny piece of steel that had seemed impossibly small from 4,000 meters away, now marked with precision. Silence fell across the range, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint whisper of wind through the flags and the distant rustle of dry grass. Gunnery Sergeant Harris could feel it, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the weight of decades of experience pressing down, and even the Marines who had laughed earlier could not look away, their mouths slightly parted, the impact of what they had witnessed settling over them without a single word. Ethan Brooks lowered the spotting scope, heart pounding, eyes wide, finally understanding what had been hinted at in stories whispered by older Marines but never truly seen. Major General Calloway took a step forward, his face betraying a mixture of recognition and respect, the faintest crease of awe across his forehead as he observed the calm control of Walt, who remained unmoved, focused, and entirely in command of the moment. The veteran lifted the rifle slightly, adjusting it with the ease of someone who had spent decades forming an instinctual bond with the weapon, and exhaled again, the long breath carrying the history, patience, and precision of a lifetime. Harris, still standing close, felt the tension leave his shoulders slightly, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of the skill, the mastery, the silent authority that the old man had always possessed but had never needed to demonstrate until now. The valley seemed to exhale with them, the light shifting across the distant ridges, dust settling back into place, and for a few heartbeats, everything was still, as if the world itself recognized the accomplishment. Calloway stepped closer, lowering his gaze to meet Walt's, a subtle nod shared between them, a silent exchange of respect that needed no words. The Marines, Harris included, felt the invisible weight of history, the decades of quiet discipline, of observation, of understanding the environment in a way that no textbook or instrument could convey. Ethan's eyes lingered on the engraving once more. CG-17, Copper Ghost. A legend alive before them, embodied in the calm, deliberate movements of an 82-year-old Marine veteran, whose presence alone had transformed an ordinary firing range into a stage where skill, patience, and mastery were displayed in perfect silence, leaving a lasting impression that would be remembered long after the echoes of the shot had faded.